Controversy. Okay, fine. You want controversy? Here's a video on what might be the most divisive piece of media in recent history. Ready Player One. Ready Player One is a 2011 young adult novel by Ernest Cline. It was later made into a movie in 2018, directed by Steven Spielberg. It follows a boy named Wade Watts and his friends as they race to solve a puzzle inside of a virtual reality video game. That doesn't sound like it would be so divisive. But to give you an idea of how people feel about it, when you Google it, the first two questions that come up are, is Ready Player One bad? And is Ready Player One good? Now, it's been a few years since the movie came out. And I know I'm way late to the party here, and there have already been 1,000 articles and videos about this. But after all this time, my feelings on the subjects are still, decidedly mixed. So I'm making this video to dig into the controversy and sort through my feelings. Let's look at the many criticisms leveled at Ready Player One, as well as anything in this book worth praising, to try and assess the value of the story it tells, if there is any. By the way, even though I'm using a lot of clips from the movie, I'm mostly focusing on the book here. That's maybe a little confusing, but this is a video essay and I need to show some kind of visual. I should probably catch you all up on what happens in the story. For the uninitiated, Ready Player One takes place in the not-so-distant future, where the world is falling apart, and everybody spends all their time in the Oasis, which is basically a gigantic virtual reality game that functions like a more advanced version of the internet. In the Oasis, people can do whatever they want and be whoever they want. Although the thing most people seem to do is play video games and inundate themselves with pop culture references. At the beginning of the book, the creator of the Oasis, James Halliday, dies. His death starts off a Willy Wonka-esque contest to find an Easter egg somewhere in the Oasis, the winner of which inherits the entire Oasis. That kicks off a race between our hero, Wade Watts, and his ragtag bunch of friends to find the egg before the giant megacorporation IOI can. That brings us to the first, simplest, most obvious criticism of Ready Player One. See, James Halliday grew up in the 1980s. As a result, every element of his contest and every corner of the story is pumped full of 80s cultural references. That's kind of the entire point of the book. The plot itself is less important than cramming as many cultural references in as possible. Every single character has an encyclopedic knowledge of all things 80s and all things nerdy. Wade progresses through the contest by playing a perfect game of Pac-Man, reciting every line from the movie War Games, and obsessively studying everything James Halliday has ever watched, read, or played. As a result, the book has been accused of being pure, mindless nostalgia. A whole bunch of references thrown together with no real depth to it. However true this is of the book, the movie has it way worse. It's made by Warner Brothers, and while the broad strokes of the plot are the same, it swaps out a bunch of the references so that it only features IP that Warner Brothers owns. I haven't taken a ton of stances on this channel about whether pieces of media are good or bad, but I think I've made my position clear on how I feel about these kinds of movies.
Behold my stuff.
Is Ready Player One full of nostalgia? Yes. Obviously, demonstrably, yes. Is it mindless? Well, that takes a bit more digging to answer. See, the critique of Ready Player One's nostalgia goes beyond it's just a bunch of silly references. If that's all it was, the story would just be goofy, harmless fun. Certainly not bad enough to explain all the hate it gets. No, there's a problem with the story and its references that goes a lot deeper. Ready Player One doesn't just feature references for reference's sake. It celebrates and reveres the very idea of references for reference's sake. Every single major movie and video game featured in its story is presented uncritically, with only positive framing. The good guys, Wade, his friends, James Halliday, love 80s culture and know all the things about 80s culture, and that's what makes them the good guys. The evil corporation IOI and its CEO Nolan Sorrento don't care about 80s culture. They only research the media in question to help them win the contest, and all they care about is making money off them. That's what makes them the bad guys. It would be a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the novel to say that the theme is books/movies/video games are good, and the people who like them are also good. Kind of an underwhelming thing to put at the heart of a narrative. But so what? It might be a little dumb, but why all the hate? Well, because the story doesn't engage critically with any of this pop culture. Not even a little bit. Every piece of media that appears as part of the story is presented as unilaterally good, and it does not explore the impact of any of those media in a meaningful way. In the world of Ready Player One, if you know every line of an 80s movie, you're a rock star. But what about the themes and ideas of that movie? What about understanding why these movies endured? What aspects of it touched the hearts of those who watched it? Or maybe even an exploration of what aspects of the movie weren't so great? Nope, none of that matters. As long as you can rattle off trivia about it, that's enough to prove that you love it. And by proxy, prove you're a good person. The example of this problem that gets the most press is the Iron Giant in the movie. The movie The Iron Giant is about a giant robot, a living weapon, who doesn't want to be a weapon. The giant spends the whole movie trying to hide and escape from the people who would use him for destructive purposes. And anytime he's forced to resort to violence, it's really upsetting to watch. And how does the Ready Player One movie use the Iron Giant? As a weapon. The main characters pilot him around to attack their enemies and blow stuff up. There is no acknowledgement of how ironic this is. The only reason he's in the movie is to make you go, hey, it's the Iron Giant, that's a thing I know. The book doesn't feature the Iron Giant so prominently, but it's full of equally weird and uncomfortable scenarios. Like, I mentioned War Games from before. War Games is a movie about a supercomputer that's in charge of all US nuclear weapons, that goes rogue and almost causes a nuclear apocalypse. Ready Player One features an extensive and detailed reference to this movie, where Wade has to recite every line that the main character says. You'd think that Ready Player One would mention how War Games featured a single machine that was given too much power, which led to deadly consequences, and draw parallels to its own story, where the Oasis is a single piece of technology that controls every aspect of everyone's lives, and contemplate what the consequences of that might be. But no, somehow these similarities never come up. All that matters in this book is that Wade knows all the words Matthew Broderick says. For more on this particular issue, check out Just Right's video essay on it. He goes into it with a lot more depth. My main mission in making this channel, and in my life, is to get people to understand how good stories influence the way you think and feel, by introducing ideas and topics in creative ways to get an emotional reaction out of you. And by seeking to understand the emotions you have about stories, you can better understand the world and yourself. Ready Player One is completely antithetical to that. It throws together a bunch of stuff you love and never once helps you investigate why you love them. It just treats that as a given, and makes you feel good for loving them, as you watch a bunch of characters who also love them win the day through their love of them. Huh. I started this video by saying I would be exploring the good and the bad of Ready Player One, but I don't think I've said a single good thing about it yet. That's the frustrating and confounding thing about it, though. On paper, it should be terrible, and yet, when I read it, I couldn't put it down. It's just so much fun blasting through this dumb story. There's something about it that's captivating, and I know I'm not the only one who thinks so. It is a best-selling mega hit after all. Part of it is the breezy, informal style and the comfortable first-person narration that makes it a super easy read. It's more than that, though. This book was written as a love letter to geek culture, and I'm a huge geek, as are many of the people who read this book. It's only natural to feel drawn to a story that reveres your favorite media the same way that you do. It's a celebration of everything you love by setting up a storyline where being a passionate, nerdy fanboy is how you win the day. And it's not just the nerdy fan service that makes it compelling. Besides nerds, this story finds a ton of ways to celebrate underdogs of all kinds. There's a pivotal scene really early on where Wade is at school in the Oasis, where he realizes that the first key to the Easter egg hunt is in his school program. And this is at a point in time where nobody else in the world has made any progress in the contest, so Wade is the very first person to figure this out. It occurs to him that James Halliday did this on purpose, because he would have liked the idea of a school kid winning the contest rather than a more capable adult, just like in all his favorite 80s movies. And just like those 80s movies, the story keeps setting up situations where Wade and his gang are scrappy underdogs facing impossible odds against older, smarter, snootier opponents. The villains of the story, Nolan Sorrento and his company IOI, are the updated version of the greedy real estate developer that's going to knock down a beloved community landmark. They're mustache-twirling levels of evil, and their plan to take over the Oasis is even more compelling now than when the book first came out, as all our favorite franchises are owned by fewer and fewer giant companies. I'm a big fan of the line from the movie where they talk about filling the Oasis with ads.
We estimate we can sell up to 80% of an individual's visual field before inducing seizures. So picture this.
Even though it's taking place in a world where nerds are on top, the book still makes nerds feel like underdogs and pitting them against an antagonist like this. One common criticism of this book that I've heard a lot is that it can't maintain much tension because Wade knows so much about nerd stuff that he breezes past all of Halliday's challenges. This is not a criticism that I agree with. It's absolutely true that Wade overcomes every obstacle in the Oasis without much trouble. Like how one scene has him playing a perfect game of Pac-Man and he goes, "Wow, good thing I'm really good at playing Pac-Man," wins, and moves on. But that's never where the tension was supposed to come from. The true conflict in the story comes from conflict between people. Like when IOI tracks down Wade in real life and blows up his house, or whenever Wade has an argument with a friend. Good stories put characters in situations where they have to do things they're not good at. And while Wade is great at all this 80s trivia, he's terrible at interacting with other humans. Another point of contention is that the story doesn't dig much into the problems in the real world. The story is set in a post-environmental deterioration hellscape, but pretty much all of the story takes place in and around the Oasis, and the outside world is barely just a backdrop. Again, this isn't a stance I can get behind. The characters in the novel have completely buried themselves in fiction and fantasy as a coping mechanism for living in this horrible reality. Wade spells out as much in the opening chapter. The book is allegedly bad for encouraging its readers to stick their heads in the sand instead of addressing their real-world issues. But let's say the book did address this, and it had the characters band together at the end to save the planet and declare that fiction will never be as important as the real world. I think if it did that, the message would ring hollow. The audience for this book is living in the 21st century, where the threat of political, social, and environmental catastrophe feels like it's constantly looming, and it usually feels like there's no solution or hope in sight. It's not easy. Reading about why Wade retreats into virtual reality instead of facing actual reality is pretty cathartic. Yeah, the characters' obsessions with fantasy are unhealthy, obviously. But I think letting that concept hang rather than moralizing about facing your problems is a valid and worthwhile creative direction to take. This book handles nostalgia and references in a way that irritates a lot of people, but it's hard to deny that there's also a solid story to go along with it. And if you're a fan of the media that it's referencing, that's another thing that makes the book just a ton of fun to read. But that's the thing though. If you're a fan of this particular media, and more specifically, if you're a particular kind of fan of this particular media. See, Ready Player One is kind of the ultimate nerd power fantasy. Back in the 1980s, liking fantasy and video games and obsessing over random trivia was the quickest way to become a social outcast. Being a nerd and a geek was synonymous with being a total loser. And that's the way things were for a long time. In Ready Player One, nerdy gamers are the coolest people in the world. James Halliday used the Oasis to instill an intense love of his favorite things in the rest of the general public, a sentiment that only increased after his death with his Easter egg hunt. Everybody is fighting to be the most knowledgeable and most intense superfan, and everybody lives their entire lives inside of a video game, where being a gamer is the default position. To a real-life nerd reading it, it's ultimate validation. The story lays out a world where nerdiness is the thing that makes you cool. Being nerdy is how you climb the social ladder, and in Halliday's contest it provides a real tangible benefit too. And at the same time it still contains the idea of nerds as outcasts. Wade describes himself as a freak and a loser multiple times despite the fact that basically every character in the book is trying to be just like him. And like I said, having IOI as the antagonist ensures that the main characters always feel small and helpless no matter how smart they are. This book is perfectly crafted to tap directly into that lonely teenage nerd who wants more than anything that validation of their identity. So this book helps nerds feel better about themselves. What's the problem then? Well, culture has changed a lot since the 80s, and even since 2011. Nerds aren't hidden away in their mother's basements anymore. Nerdy stuff is everywhere now. The internet is exploding with fandom communities, and being interested in these kinds of things has become the norm, not the exception. Reading comic books used to get you beat up, and now all the biggest movies that come out every year are based on them.
Beautiful people, haven't you heard? The joke's on you, it's Revenge of the Nerds.
This explosion of nerd culture has been pretty cool for a ton of reasons. But this has also exposed a dark side to it all. If you're watching this video, I'm willing to bet you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Nerds on the internet can be mean. Really, really mean. Open Twitter on any given day and you'll see people throwing fits over the disappointing latest installment of their favorite franchise, tearing each other apart over differing opinions, and shunning anyone who they don't think is a real fan. Many of these nerds still hold on to the idea that being nerdy makes you an outcast. and they treat their fandoms like an exclusive in-group that they guard ferociously against outsiders who might taint it. And mixed in with all of that is tons of sexism, racism, and homophobia against characters and creators who aren't straight white men. In the most extreme cases, this has taken the form of coordinated harassment, causing incalculable emotional harm. In Ready Player One, not all fandom is created equal. Most noticeably, there aren't any references to properties targeted at girls. At best, there are some John Hughes movies that both boys and girls can like, but you're not going to see anybody in this book obsessing over Barbie or Nancy Drew. It doesn't help things that Artemis, Wade's love interest, is pretty flat as a character. She's very much a not like the other girls type, and she somehow falls in love with Wade despite him acting pretty insufferable towards her for most of the story. She's the archetypal gamer girl fantasy, who's there for the predominantly male readers to drool over. Besides that, Wade constantly takes potshots at media that aren't worth his time. The only media worth celebrating are the ones that James Halliday liked. In other words, all the things a lonely, nerdy boy would have liked in the 80s. This book celebrates a pretty narrow version of nerdiness. One that prioritizes memorizing and studying minute details of their fandom, rather than any kind of meaningful emotional engagement with it. One that encourages gatekeeping of what makes someone a real nerd. And one that attracts readers who have a chip on their shoulder about being an outcast, by making them feel like the most important people in the world. It's a celebration of all the most toxic parts of nerd culture.
You're gonna go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole.
Now, do I believe all that? I don't know. Everything I just laid out, that's what all of Ready Player One's biggest critics have to say about it. Actually, in the criticisms I read, most of them were a lot harsher than that. I think there are a lot of valid reasons to think that the target audience of this book contains a lot of really insufferable people. And I do wish that the story had something more meaningful within it besides all the empty references. But when people try to say that it promotes toxic behavior in the online nerd community, that seems a little extreme. Yes, this book is targeted mostly at boys, but I don't think it's fair to hold this book to the impossible standard of appealing to every kind of nerd in the world. I'm disappointed that it leaves a lot of irritating nerd behaviors unchallenged. But you don't have to be a toxic, nostalgia-obsessed gatekeeper to enjoy this story. If that were true, it never would have gotten as popular as it did. I have a hard time believing that this story is capable of causing the harm that its worst detractors claim. The love story is super cringeworthy though. I'm not defending that at all.
Wow. So much slower here. The wind, the people. Everything.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
So where does that leave us? Is Ready Player One good or bad? My analysis has been inconclusive. I think there's a lot to love within it, and I also think it could have been a lot better. That would be where I leave things. Except, a few years ago, Ready Player One got itself a sequel, Ready Player Two. It came and went without much fanfare. By the time it was published, the majority opinion on the series around the internet had skewed pretty negative. So most people scoffed at the very idea of a sequel, had fun ripping it to shreds on Twitter for a few days, and then moved on. But Ready Player 2 might be the single most interesting sequel I've ever read. It completely upends everything we thought we knew about the first book, and directly addresses virtually all the criticisms of it. The basic premise is that, now that Wade and friends have won the egg hunt, they now have full ownership of the Oasis. The way they're running things is making a ton of people angry though, and a lot of that anger is justified. Wade let the power go to his head, and he regularly abuses it early in the book. The main plot kicks up when a rogue AI copy of James Halliday's brain takes over the Oasis and holds the brains of every user hostage. So it's up to Wade and co to make it through another nostalgia-fueled virtual scavenger hunt to shut him down. You can tell almost immediately that Ernest Cline took a lot of what people were saying about his work to heart. You thought that the first book was full of references with no critical engagement? Ready Player 2's references have tons more depth. The book has less breadth of references, and instead gives a lot more time to a few select media properties. With each one, the book digs into some of the more problematic elements of each media in question. In the section dedicated to Lord of the Rings, the characters talk about the series' nearly 100% white cast of characters. When they fight through the entire career of the rock star Prince, they have a conversation about his complicated relationship with the LGBTQ community. And beyond the questions of diversity and politics, the story is finally addressing questions about why these pop culture icons captured the imaginations of so many people. Sometimes it's actually kind of clumsy, like the characters are turning to the camera to explain their beliefs. But it's a really wild thing to see after the first book. The dystopian setting felt like window dressing rather than an integral part of the plot. Here the characters are staring down the looming possibility of the extinction of the human race. While they mess around in the Oasis, they're also working to solve the global problems in the outside world too. You thought Wade was a smarmy entitled fanboy? Well, here he's going to fall farther than he ever did in the first book. This story is in first-person narration from Wade's point of view again, but the difference here is that Wade is telling the story in the future, a while after the events of this book are finished. The whole story of Ready Player 2 is about him self-reflecting on all the terrible, stupid things he does during Ready Player 2. Wade pushes to integrate an experimental new technology into the Oasis because he's too obsessed with the possibility to recognize the dangers. He fights with his friends and refuses to compromise on what he wants. And he even uses his near-invincible avatar to kill Oasis players who criticize him. The whole time this is happening, future Wade is narrating with basically a continuous facepalm while talking about his past self. Also, Artemis has way more agency and autonomy in this book. Early on, she dumps Wade for being a total self-absorbed jerk, and Wade only wins her back at the end after he's learned a serious lesson of humility. Where the first book only required Wade to know a bunch of pop culture references to save the day and get the girl, this story forces him to dig deep and do some serious character growth. If Ready Player 1 allowed toxic nerds to revel in the behaviors that made them toxic, Ready Player 2 forcibly shoves a mirror into their faces and forces them to recognize how those attitudes are harmful. And then there's James Halliday. In the first book, Halliday was basically a god, all-powerful and all good. He was the ultimate nerd who rose to spectacular success while still living his entire life as a socially awkward hermit. As far as we could tell, he never did a single bad thing during his lifetime, and everybody looks to him as a guide for which cultural touchstones to obsess over and how to live in the Oasis. Just like how members of a given fandom might worship its creator, everyone in the story treats Halliday as infallible. Ready Player 2 gives us an extended look into the real-life Halliday, giving us a much more complicated and troubled character. The AI copy of his brain is the villain of this book, and while it's not exactly a one-to-one recreation of what he was in life, AI Halliday is arrogant, self-important, and completely lacking in empathy. We learn that Halliday did a lot of morally questionable things when the Oasis was first starting up, and he made more than a few sleazy moves to try and woo his lifelong crush, Kira. The most prevalent theme in this book is that the creators of your favorite media are fallible. Blind worship of those media and those creators is dangerous, and you should be aware that they can't be perfect. Alongside analysis of all the many references, the breaking down of Wade and Halliday is the 1-2 punch that hammers in the idea that we are all human, we all have blind spots, and we all make mistakes. And that statement also includes the very author of these books, Ernest Cline, because when Ready Player 2 came out, pretty much all the attention surrounding it focused on how badly he screwed up his portrayal of gender identity. This is the notorious passage that went viral. And while it looks worse out of context, without the understanding that Wade is constantly beating himself up for misunderstanding things like this, it's still pretty bad. The phrase non-binary sex appears in the book more than once, a phrase that makes absolutely no sense, and it's painfully obvious that Ernest Cline doesn't know anything about non-binary people. Given the context of the story's theming though, it makes the fact that this is the only takeaway most people had all the more frustrating. The whole book is about how you can't reduce authors and creators to only good or only bad, and most people seem to have done exactly that here. But this reaction was pretty inevitable, I think. There are so few sequels out there that have done such an about-face and tone and theming. With all these changes to the story's ethos, it's like this book was written specifically to appease people who hated the first book the most. But those people were never going to give it a chance. It seems like everyone in that camp latched onto the gender identity issue as the reason not to bother looking for whatever value the book might have. And lots of fans of the first book were upset by the sudden shift in focus. Because of all this, Ready Player 2 ended up being a book that couldn't make anyone happy, and its reviews are dramatically more negative than its predecessor. Is Ready Player 2 some kind of masterpiece? No. It's got the same problems that a lot of unplanned sequels have, where the story has already been wrapped up and the process of squeezing out a whole second book's worth of plot is clumsy. And the excitement, the fun factor from the first book is missing. And couldn't he have just hired a sensitivity reader to make sure he had a decent portrayal of trans people? They're not that expensive, and I know he must be rolling in Time Warner money. But This is a book that took a ton of huge artistic risks, and I can't help but admire it. So, back to our original question. Is Ready Player One good? Well, in a weird way, Ready Player 2 reads almost like an admission of guilt from Ernest Cline. It's like he heard the issues people had with his earlier work and wrote this to say, "You're right, I'm sorry, it could have been better. I can do better." Going back to think about Ready Player 1 after having read Ready Player 2 makes all those flaws all the more noticeable by contrast. But instead of looking at it so negatively, I prefer to think of it more like nerd culture evolving. Back when Ready Player 1 first came out, its readers were happy to indulge in mindless nostalgia bait. But since then, there's been a lot of pushback against that kind of empty fan service. A story like this, we've outgrown it. That doesn't mean that people can't or won't still enjoy it. It just means that we're now in a place where we can ask for something more from our media. Media that considers all of the complexities of what it means to be a nerd in this time and place.
I think he pissed himself.
Okay, how was that? I know it was unsatisfying, but it was how I feel about it, okay? I'm not just gonna take a hardline stance I don't believe in. More! You want more controversy? Alright. More hot takes coming up.